and today's subject is titled Polygyny. This is part A. The issue of polygyny has perhaps been the most controversial topic since reformers of this 19th century began to question the plausibility of Islam's traditional marriage law. It is certainly one of the key issues that women in the Arab Muslim world today face in their struggle for liberation and emancipation. If this issue is ever to be resolved once and for all, Muslim believers worldwide must come to terms with the modern age and the problems that come with it. The reform we propose is to understand the verses of polygyny contained in the al-kitab as hudud verses pointing to upper and lower limits, which allow us to legislate in accordance with concrete historical condition in society and to appeal to the most noble and universal aspects of all human beings. The verse of polygyny, or should we say the verse about its abolition, can be found in Surah An-Nisa, the fourth surah, and hence right at the beginning of the book. It only consists of one verse, chapter 4, verse 3, and nowhere else in the entire text is polygyny mentioned again. The mistake of traditional exegetics has been to treat this verse consistently detached from its textual context, ignoring the preceding verses which discuss how to avoid injustice to orphans. As a result, polygyny was legalized for its isolation from the issue of marriages to widowed mothers of orphans, and thus in isolation from its divine ratio legis. In order to rectify this mistake, we will give the reader the exact sequence of the first verse of Surah An-Nisa. The surah begins with God's calls to humankind to show reverence to the guardian Lord. O humankind, reverence your guardian Lord who created you from a single person, as translated, created of like nature, his mate, and from them twain scattered like seas, countless men and women. Reverence God through whom you demand your mutual rights, and reverence the wombs that bore you, for God ever watches over you. Nisa 1. May I make a small note that not exactly the translation of the Quran or the book in English is always correct. Not always. It's not like its original form in Arabic is completely different. This is just something to make it clear, but it does not really define 100% how is it said in Arabic. Therefore, you need to understand the words, what the words mean, and then how how the letters mean, then how the words mean, and then how to connect the words together, and then what's before and what's after, and then it goes on like that. It's levels, but this is close enough. But we will explain anything difficult later on. It continues in verse 2 with a call to humankind not to squander the property of orphans, but to take good care of it. The orphans restore their property when they reach their age, nor substitute your worthless things for their good ones, and devour not their substance by mixing it up with your one. For this is indeed a great sin. Nisa 2. Then comes the crucial third verse, in which humankind is ordered to allow marriage to 2 or 3 or 4 wives on condition that people fear that they are unable to deal justly with orphans. The condition is underlined. If you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly, la tuqsitu, with the orphans, marry women of your choice, ma taba lakum, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly, Allah ta'dilu, with them, then only one. Or a captive that your right hand possesses, or ma malakat aymanakum. That will be more suitable to prevent you from having too great of a burden. Allah tu'ulu. Nisa 3. Verse 4 follows by ordering the obligation of a bridal gift and asks women to take it and enjoy it with right good cheer, while verse 5 forbids people from handing over their property to the feeble-minded, but requires them to feed and clothe them and speak to them words of kindness and justice. After this, verse 6 returns once more to the question of orphans. Make trial of orphans until they reach the age of marriage. Nisa 6. These verses mention the matter of justice several times, using terms such as qist and adl. Both terms are auto-antonymous or contraniums, words that have opposite and self-contradictory meanings. The word qist, for example, can mean both doing justice, as in chapter 5, verse 42, for God loves those who judge in equity, al-muqsitun, and doing injustice, as in chapter 72, verse 15, but those who swerve, al-qasitun, they are but fuel for hellfire. And adl denotes equity or balance on the one hand, and inequity and imbalance on the other. Moreover, there exists a subtle semantic difference between qist and adl, even if they both mean justice, equality, whereas qist implies that justice is done by only one side of the involved parties. Adl connotes a demonstration of justice by all, or at least two sides. The morphological root of the mathematical term equation, mu'adala, indicates an equality between two sides, as in x equals y. Can be found in adl but not in qist. Orphans, whether male or female, are legal minors, children that have not yet reached puberty, and they are fatherless in the context Surah Nisa. They are orphans whose mother is still alive. Verse 6 says, make trial of orphans until they reach the age of marriage. Nisa 6. Indicated that orphans have not yet reached sexual maturity, and the absence of their father is pointed out in the following verse. As for the wall, it belonged to two youth orphans in the town. There was beneath it a burial treasure to which they were entitled. Their father had been a righteous man. Kahf 82. As well as in the two passages that imply the absence of the guardian who normally takes care of the children's property, and come not nigh to the orphan's property except to improve it. An'am 152. And to orphans restore their property when they reach their age. Chapter 4, verse 2. These verses urge people to take care of orphans' property as they have become fatherless and are living with their now widowed mother. The case that orphans have lost both parents, including the mother, is not covered in the Polygamy verses. Chapter 4, verse 3. Because if both parents had died, the question of remarriage would not occur at all. And if they were motherless orphans who stayed with their widowed father, the father's step for a possible remarriage were legally unproblematic and are therefore not in any way discussed in this verse. Allah wants us to be kind to orphans who are minor and who have lost their fathers, and He wants us to take care of their property until they have reached majority. How are we supposed to do this? If we, for instance, fear that we cannot do justice to all of them equally, if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, we may, as the Polygamy verse suggests, consider marrying their mother. Marry women of your choice. These men who are addressed here and who are asked to consider marriage to a widowed mother of orphans are men who are already married to one wife and who have children of their own. The verse explicitly says, marry 2 or 3 or 4, starting to count with 2, not 1, thereby excluding men who are single and also whose have no children. Hence, Allah does not give unconditional permission for polygyny. First, He requests that the second, third, or fourth wives are widowed mothers of fatherless minors. Second, such polygynous marriages are only allowed if there is justifiable fear that one cannot give orphans equal share. If these two conditions are not met, a polygynous marriage cannot be considered legally valid. Allah's qualification, ma taba lakum, which contains His permission to take more than one wife, has been the subject of lengthy debate among exegetists. It has often been understood as a free license for polygyny in the sense of marrying women of your choice. It is unthinkable for us that God could have meant that men can have as many wives as it pleases them, and that it was revealed to encourage men arbitrary selection of whatever woman was available. If Allah had really intended to please women's sexual desire, He would have said, marry woman you want. Instead of, He said, ma taba lakum, which means marry such women as seem good to you. Such expression demands kindness and generosity towards women who have lost their husbands, the provider of the family and the guardians of their children, and who are at the mercy of whatever suitor is willing to take them. As seeing good to you calls for men's generosity and open heart and their compassion to the plight of the poor women who have to care for their orphans' children. Justice, kindness, and fairness are at the heart of the Polygyny verse. And yet, Allah must have anticipated this, that the powerful appeal to humanity as expressed in this verse might lead to a situation in which some men, in their relentless endeavor to please God, fulfill this obligation and marry a widowed woman with children without actually having the means to maintain them. This will result in many emotional and economic tensions, whereby they are pulled between their own children of the first wife and the adopted orphan children from their co-wives, resulting in a state of imbalance and injustice. This is the reason Allah revealed the second part of His verse, in which people are advised about the pitfalls of polygyny and are urged to stay monogamous. Some exegetists thought that this refers to the danger that in a polygamous marriage, a husband might not give his several co-wives the same conjugal rights. However, the verse is not about equal sexual satisfaction of co-wives, but about equality in terms of social and economic justice. The verse deals, after all, with the issue of orphan children, not with marital problems, since it discusses the question of how to treat orphans justly, that is, equal to the husband's own children. The verse ends with an admonition to avoid injustice by not committing yourself to a polygamous marriage to prevent you from having too great of a burden, alla tu'ulu, that is, from having too many dependents to care for. The verse of polygyny was intended to solve a crisis in the nascent Islamic community. The Arabian society of the 7th century was exhausted by the many wars that were fought in defense of the new religion, and the streets of Mecca and Medina were full of orphan children who had lost their fathers on the battlefield. In those difficult years, Allah's revelation of the polygyny verse was a great relief for a society that did not know orphanages or state-sponsored charities for children. The polygyny verse should better be called the verse of adoption, because it basically aims at regulating the process of adopting orphan children into existing families. It does not deal with the marital issues of polygyny as such. The danger is that this verse is read in isolation from the historical circumstances of its revelation and is interpreted as Allah's eternal order to unconditionally marry up to 4 wives, regardless of the social or historical context. An example, regardless of whether orphan children exist or not. It would be extremely irresponsible to allow the practice of polygyny in a society in times of peace, when there is no significant numerical imbalance between men and women, where the number of widowed women with small children is insignificantly low, and where there are properly functioning systems of adoption and care through orphanages. Some fuqaha have fabricated long lists of reasons why men are allowed to marry more than one wife. They have said, for example, that polygyny could be justified if a woman cannot give birth, or if she is chronically ill, or she has acquired some sort of physical or mental disability. These reasons are, in our opinion, totally unacceptable and completely against the essence of Allah's revelation. We need to ask the fuqaha, why only women? Can men not become sterile, barren, and impotent? Are there not men who are disabled or chronically ill? Why do you not allow women to be polygamous and let them marry a second, third, or fourth co-husband? Let us reiterate that Allah's main concern was to create justice for orphan children and to call for mercy for widowed mothers of young children. Polygyny was proposed as a solution to the social dilemma of not being able to care justly for orphans. It was not to solve the sexual problems a marital couple might have. As a restriction to polygamy, as a restriction to monogamy, pardon me, as a restriction to monogamy was issued immediately afterward, covering the situation where a father faced the social problem of an unbalanced treatment between his blood children and the children he adopted. Verse 127 of chapter 4 of the same surah basically reissues the moral appeal of verses 2 and 6, the same chapter 4. They ask you for instruction concerning the women. Say, God does instruct you about them, and remember what has been rehearsed unto you in the book concerning the orphans of women, Yatama and Nisa, to whom you give not the portion prescribed, and yet whom you desire to marry, as also concerning the children who are weak and oppressed, that you stand firm for justice, al-qist, to orphans. There is not a good deed which you do, but God is well acquainted therein. Nisa 127. This verse has not escaped the superficial reading of traditional exegetics. Although the verse reiterates the previous call for justice to orphan, al-yatama nisa, al-yatama bil-qist, almost word for word, most commentators do not link this verse with chapter 4, 2 to 6, because of their misreading of orphans of women, Yatam Nisa, which they understood to mean orphan woman. There are several considerations that speak against this interpretation by scholars. The Arabic Yatam Nisa contains a genitive construct literally the orphans of the woman, and do not attribute and are not attributive compound of noun and adjective. In example, women who are orphans, or orphan woman. Also, the Arabic term nisa is the plural of imra'ah, a woman who has reached marital age. Orphans, however, are by definition in 4:6 not yet of marital age. Thus, to call someone an orphan woman is a contradiction in terms, and as nonsensical as to call a male person an orphan man, because male orphans are by definition minor boys. In sum, verse chapter 4, 127 must be understood in connection with the orphan verses, chapter 4, verse 2 through 6, because both similarly call upon people to stand up for justice to orphans, children. To interpret chapter 4, verse 127 in the context of orphan women is a mischievous attempt to draw the attention away from the true message of the verse. Now we move on to the application of the theory of limit. The verse of polygyny contains an upper and lower limit whose exact definition has to be stated in quantitative or qualitative terms. 1. Quantitative limits. The purely quantitative calculation is based on the passage marry. It says 2 or 3 or 4, starting with number 2. That is double the number of the first wife. Since a man cannot marry himself or half a woman, he inferred that the lower limit of marriage is 1 and that the upper limit is 4. The separate presentation of each number, marry 2 or 3 or 4, instead of saying marry up to 4, stresses that there are dealing here with whole numbers, not with fractions, implying a whole commitment, not just a fraction 0.9. For example, if we prohibit polygyny completely, we would still be within Allah's limit, as we would legally and quantitatively stand on the lower limit of 1. No verse of the book explicitly prohibits us from doing so. If we allowed polygyny with up to 4 women, we would move between Allah's limits towards the upper limit of 4. By focusing on a purely quantitative interpretation of the Polygyny verse, traditional Islamic legislation has done exactly this and has allowed polygynous marriages without any qualitative consideration. The only qualification permitted with regards to the conditional clause, but if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly, was to demand a balanced treatment of all co-wives. As this condition is difficult to meet, some schools of law came to the conclusion that 1 wife should be the norm, and that Only in exceptional circumstances should polygamous relationship be permitted. Number two, qualitative limits. The qualitative limits are defined by the virginal status of the woman. If she is still a virgin, she will be treated differently from a woman who has lost her virginity. And if she has lost her virginity, one will have to qualify whether she is a divorced woman or a widow. This qualitative assessment is needed to link the conditional clause, if you fear that you shall not be able to deal justly with the orphans, to the response, then marry women of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. If we conclude these qualitative criteria in our analysis of a polygyny, we come to the following conclusion. 1. With regards to the first wife, no specification is given. She might be a virgin or divorcee or a widow. 2. The marriage to co-wives 2, 3, or 4 is, however, qualified by reference to justice to orphans, from which we infer that co-wives 2 to 4 must be widowed mothers of orphan women who have lost their virginity, of course. In this case, the quantitative limits are still between 1 and 4, while the qualitative criteria restrict polygamous relationship to marriages of widows with small children. The marriage contract must include the adoption and financial support of the orphan children by a man who is already married to a first wife. Legislators are encouraged to issue polygyny laws in the light of the social and cultural conditions of the time. If in time of wars we face, for example, a serious shortage of men and a sudden increase of fatherless children, legislators may consider changing laws that prescribe monogamous relationship and introduce laws that allow polygyny of up to 4 wives. This may include permission to marry more than 2 widow wives who have no children at all. Absolutely forbidden are marriage to widows if the potential husband is not willing to adopt the orphans whom the widow wants to bring into the new marriage. The wives of the Prophet. Some clarifying words are now in order with regards to Muhammad's polygamous marriages to more than 4 wives, which has caused enormous irritation among the critics of Islam in the past. What we need to consider is that Muhammad's mission took place during a transition period between 2 historical epochs of humankind. History has been in 2 stages: the ages of human civilization before Muhammad's mission and after it. The current age, after his mission, will last until the coming of the last hour. Even though Muhammad's messengerhood introduced the beginning of the second historical epoch after his mission, his own marriages were still arranged according to the traditions and custom of the old epoch before his mission. It's plain and simple. This is confirmed by the following verse. There can be no difficulty to the Prophet in what God has indicated to him as duty. It was the practice approved of God, sunnatullah, among those of old who have passed away, and the command of God is a decree determined. Ahzab 38. We should avoid judging his polygamous marriages by the standard of and norms of the second historical period he helped to initiate. We should not, for example, postulate that to marry more than 4 wives was a special dispensation for prophets, since the presupposes that a restriction on polygamy was already in place as a norm at Muhammad's time. But this clearly was not the case. It follows from this that we are not supposed to imitate Muhammad's example with regard to these marriages. Note that the previous verse explicitly used the term prophet, Nabi, and not messenger. And we know that only what Muhammad did as a messenger is meant to be a role model to be followed by the Muslim believers. You have indeed in the apostle, Rasul of God, a beautiful pattern of conduct. Ahzab 21, verse 38 of Surah Ahzab, makes the point that Allah had asked his prophet to do things that were practiced among those of old who have passed away, which is as a clear sign for us not to follow Muhammad in that. 2 things can be deduced from this. 1, the normative study of the Prophet's marriages is a pointless exercise because it would inevitably mean to assess his polygamous relationship from the perspective of contemporary norms and practices. It would confuse the standards of his pre-mission marital practices with the post-mission marital norms that his messengerhood, and this excludes his marriages, aim to introduce. 2. Inasmuch as Muhammad's polygamous marriages cannot be a model for us to follow, the same is true regarding the behavior of Muhammad's wives. Allah said, O consorts of the Prophet, Ya Nisa an-Nabi, you are not like any of other women. Ahzab 32. This verse addresses only the women of the Prophet, indicating that no legislation is intended here, just information that is not binding legally. It is just suggested practice. Now, concluding remarks on polygamy. We have seen that permission of polygamy is conditional, expressed in the clause, if you fear. Allah gave it, as we pointed out, in order to solve an acute social problem, surplus of women, in the war-torn society of 7th century Arabia. It is now up to us to either use Allah's permission if, and only if, the condition fear is fulfilled and the social circumstances are similar. If the condition and circumstances are not given, we must not permit polygamy. This may lead to the situation in which one country will introduce a polygamous law, while another country may abolish it because the country's political and economic situation is entirely different. In both instances, however, legislators have to back up their decision by statistical data, representative surveys of existing marital relationship, and consultation with the population. If legal decisions are taken on the basis of sound empirical evidence, and a country like Syria allows polygamy while Saudi Arabia prohibits it, we will have to accept that two legislative decisions, even if contradictory, are both sound. And just like lately, Tunis is against it, bans it. They made it illegal because this is how they see it. Should the social circumstances in these countries change again, polygamy legislation will have to be reconsidered. Therefore, neither the decision in Syria nor that in Saudi Arabia is forever fixed and eternally valid. The dilemma of traditional jurisprudence is that the fuqaha never bother to consult people and ask what they think about polygamy. They have been so occupied with the task to implement Allah's rule on earth based on their narrow understanding of the concept of hakimiyah that they forgot to ask what this rule actually meant for people in their daily life. Far from being a practical solution to real problems, polygamy has become a matter of right and wrong, haram or halal, while they ignore the fact that a haram interdiction is all-comprehensive and implies an eternally valid taboo, and that halal allows the changing legislation on the basis of empirical proof, statistical data, and proper parliamentary debate. As a matter of fact, polygamous relationships are not a matter of right or wrong. If a country has ruled that polygamy is forbidden on the grounds that the state provides enough care for orphans, children, and sufficient financial support for widowed mothers of small children, a violation of that law must be sanctioned by social disapproval and prosecuted by the state authorities. But it must not be classified religiously as adultery or sin. If a country decides to ban polygamy, it does not mean, as some claim, a prohibit that Allah has allowed, since God gave us the right to legislate in these matters. If someone, for example, wants to ban smoking in public places, which Allah allowed, this person will have to provide hard evidence for the harmful effects of smoking on people's health, secondhand smoke. And on this basis, Parliament might then decide to ban smoking in pubs, restaurants, and workplaces, such as what happened right now, as example, in New York City or in other cities and states. They ban smoking in public places. Such a ban neither deliberately nor ignores Allah's permission, nor it is eternally fixed, because one might in future develop a kind of tobacco that is not harmful. One has to draw a fine line between absolutely forbidden things, haram taboos, and those that are temporary ban, mamnu. Human legislation can never claim to have stipulated absolute taboos, the prerogative of Allah, because circumstances might change that require new legislation. And those practices, an example, polygyny, smoking, for example, that used to be permitted, might be found to undermine public good, health, and welfare, which would necessitate their public ban, although not forever. We need to understand the status of the prophetical sunnah in similar ways. During his lifetime, Muhammad exercised ijtihad in matters of Allah permission by either ordering or banning what Allah has permitted. But none of Muhammad's decisions have eternal validity. Today, prophetical sunnah is embodied in the many academic institutions and legislative assemblies that a modern nation state possesses. Matters of rituals and religious worship are different. They are not part of Muhammad's prophetical sunnah, only of his sunnah as a messenger, and are therefore dealt with by muftis and their ifta councils. Competence and leadership, al-qawama, is next